AGM, which we'll try to make as informal as possible. And do make sure you've got a glass of wine to help along that process if you haven't got one. And I think John, my colleague here, who's the secretary of IBBY, will be passing around attendance while we're doing it. So, should we start with you?
No, fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to have all of you here. And I should be actually doing something with slides, I think, because we are a visual medium, but I'm afraid that we haven't got a projector down here. I will have to step away after I've talked. I would love to stay for your meeting, but I hope you understand. And so House of Illustration, where did it come from? You probably know a lot of the story already, but I'm going to tell it to you again in my own way. My background is, I should just say briefly, so I studied art history at university. I then went to work at the Barbican Centre, where I was head of fundraising for 7 years. Then I went to the National Gallery for 12 years, where I was one of the senior management team there. And then I ran Charleston, the Bloomsbury House in Sussex, for 7 years. And then I had a year off doing really rather nice things with the family. And then I came to House of Illustration. But my link with House of Illustration goes right back to the beginning, because in 1999, Quentin Blake did an exhibition at the National Gallery called Tell Me a Picture. And you probably all remember it. It was a really important exhibition, and it was very exciting. And at the time, and I can still remember the exhibition committee meeting where we discussed it as a proposal, and I still remember the reaction of some of my curatorial colleagues who said, what can an illustrator tell us about, about art collection, about paintings? We haven't ever had someone from outside coming in and curating a show before. Why do we start now? And there were those who said, well, actually, Quentin's view of these works and the way in which he tells stories around them, or he brings out the stories, is really, really important. And we think it would be fantastic for our visitors and appealing to a sort of visitor we don't get at the moment. And our collection is about pictures that tell stories. And actually, too dry an approach where it's, it was painted by Rembrandt in his late period, and very interesting, but actually there's so much more going on in these works. We did the exhibition. From the day it opened, we had queues around the block at the National Gallery. It was one of the most successful exhibitions we'd ever done in the Sunday room at the National Gallery. And it was a delight working with Quentin. And around that time, he started thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if there was an organisation that existed to celebrate illustration in all its forms, which had illustration above the doorway? And there was a discussion that started then, and 2 years later, in 2002, House of Illustration was created as a charity to do just that, to raise the standing of, appreciation of, interest in illustration in all its forms, to celebrate illustration, with the long-term aim that ultimately there will be a building that would be devoted to illustration. And that was 2002. We opened our doors last year, in 2014, after a very, very long period as a virtual organisation with a very small staff. A lot of that time working in donated office space, really with a skeleton team of full-time staff. Flora, who some of you will have known, who did the most amazing job here over a very long period, kind of leading the organisation. A very good group of trustees, with Quentin as our sort of founding trustee. But actually over that period of 12 years, as you can imagine as well, the trustee group changing pretty much entirely, apart from one or two trustees, like Elaine Kenyon, who was, when I was at the National Gallery, one of our senior education department team members. Michael Wilson, who was our head of exhibitions and display. We still have a chap called Chris Yates, who is now deputy director of the British Museum, but was our head of finance at the National Gallery in those days. So there's a strong National Gallery kind of pedigree and link. Anyway, so fast forward 12 years. In the intervening 12 years, as you know, we put on a lot of exhibitions, working with other organisations, working with Dulwich Picture Gallery, working with Compton Verney, working with the National Gallery again, working with all sorts of places to do illustration-related exhibitions that would then go on tour, and also doing a lot of education outreach. And the results on the wall behind you are some of the books that have resulted from work that we've done with primary and secondary schools. And I would urge you, if at some point in the proceedings this evening you have a chance, have a look at some of them and just sort of see the work that young children working with illustrators, professional illustrators, are capable of, and the way in which that work leads into all sorts of other outcomes linked to the national curriculum, linked to all sorts of things. There's a brilliant one on science, which looks at, our understanding of the scientific world is so linked to illustration. and that just demonstrates the way in which children respond to the world around them through their drawings. Anyway, there was a huge fundraising campaign that started about 5 years ago to raise significant money to get our own premises. Originally we wanted to have a building all of our own that we owned, and this building was identified, and it was £6 million was the cost, and it became clear quite quickly that we would never raise the money required to buy the building. And then negotiations started between the Art Fund, who are upstairs now, and Argent, who are the developers of the estate. And they were persuaded that actually they didn't want all the space, that they should allow House of Illustration to take over the ground floor and the basement floor, which is what happened. A huge fundraising campaign raised 1.7 million to enable us to fit out the space, the gallery space upstairs, and to open our doors, and to give us some sort of financial cushion in the first few years of operation, because we know we received no public money at all, no public funding as an organisation. And so the 4th of July last year, we opened our doors for the first time with an exhibition of Quentin Blake's work, sorry, the Charleston connection. Bloomsbury is still all these Quentins. Quentin Blake's work, which was a fabulous success, and it was called, God, I've forgotten what it was called, Inside Stories, looking at the way in which he as an illustrator worked. But crucially, two things that I really should say about House of Illustration. First of all, House of Illustration, why was it called that? It was called House of Illustration because the desire was to distinguish us from museums and galleries, which could be very off-putting architecturally or by the very name to a lot of people. We see ourselves as having a much, much broader appeal than really any museum or gallery devoted to any of the fine arts. And so House of Illustration, it's a home for illustration. We wanted a building that looked like a child's drawing of a house, which we've succeeded here with. And the other thing in terms of illustration, it's not just about illustrated books or children's illustrated books, it's about the whole breadth of illustration in all its forms. One of our missions is to reappropriate a lot of artists you would think of not as illustrators, but Michelangelo and Leonardo, they were illustrators. A lot of their best known work is illustration. There's no other way of describing it. Religious art over the last 800 years is illustration. It's basically, it's work that, it tells the story for an audience who are largely illiterate. And the distinction between artists and illustrators is an artificial one which came in really at the start of the 19th century. For us, all of the work of anyone from Rembrandt, Van Dyck, going back, Duccio, you name them, these are all illustrators. Interestingly, the Royal Academy, 75% of academicians since the founding of the Royal Academy have done illustration work. So it is an artificial distinction, and we will be reappropriating over the years all of these here at House of Illustration. So you have to watch that, and National Gallery and Royal Academy, watch out. But also other forms of illustration. So technical illustration is a really important area. The Matt Connor show, which I hope you've all seen upstairs, one of the fascinating things about that, and I can talk about that show if you're interested, he did a correspondence course in illustration in the 1930s, was producing extraordinary work even before he did his correspondence course in the 1930s, went into the Navy, American Navy in 1942, and he illustrated technical manuals that explained how you fired your such and such gun, or how you put on your Mae West or whatever. So important. Illustrators, they tell us how to do things. They show us how to do things. The instruction manuals that you get from IKEA have been done not necessarily particularly well by an illustrator, but illustration is so important to us. Scientific illustration. I come from a medical family. My father's a dermatologist. It was a 19th century Spanish doctor with a particular interest in skin diseases, who also was a very talented artist, who recognized that rather than telling his colleagues, okay, the thing that you need to look out for is, starts off with a particular kind of wart and then develops to such and such. Oh, if you draw it, it can be reproduced, and suddenly everyone knows what to look for. Medical illustration. I have to say, I was brought up with the most gruesome illustrations, just that were hanging around the house or that appeared through the letterbox on a kind of weekly basis, in terms of the Journal of Dermatology and so on. And illustration is still very important in that area. Photographs can do something, but they can't actually do as much as illustration can do. It's such a broad area. It strays into graphic design. It's a big subject, and I could talk about it for hours, and I won't because I'm But things like tattoos, that is a form of illustration. Tattoos are ways in which people tell personal stories. They tell stories about themselves, about their families, about who is important to them, what is important. And sometimes it's fictionalized. So, you know, I live in Brighton, and we were on the beach last summer, me and my family, and my eldest daughter said to me, Daddy, you're the only man on the beach who hasn't got a beard and tattoos. And I said, no, that's true, no I haven't. So you know I have no tattoos. But I looked around, and there's a big gay community in Brighton, and it's very interesting. There's a whole mythology about tattoos that you know, gay men have. And it's linked in Brighton, in particular areas, to prison tattoos. But it's a fictionalized sort of, you know, account of themselves. It's, you know, it's so interesting. There are mythologies and stories linked to the way in which people use art on their body. Look at David Beckham's body. It is absolutely, this is biography. This is about his family. It's about, you know, the things that have shaped him, that have been important to him. It's a fascinating area. But also, what I want to say is that for us, illustration is incredibly broad. And you will see over the next few years when, as an organisation, we're only less than a year old, you know, we're establishing our credentials, and we will be trying to explore all these different strands of illustration. So we've got to do, there's a fascinating area which is called storyboarding for cinema. And I came across someone the other day who has the original storyboards for Abel Gance's Napoleon, the film. And, you know, how extraordinary that from that point, right the way through to Toy Story, you know, today, or the, you know, they're all governed by someone sitting down and drawing storyboards. This is what's happening after this, after this, after this. Advertising. Matt Connor is a great example, you know, of how an illustration can be so much more compelling than a photograph. You've got the photographs that he used for inspiration. They're wooden. They don't have anything of the verve, the colour, the, you know, the things that compel you to read the story or buy the product. And we will be exploring all these things as we go forward. So we opened with an exhibition of Quentin's work, which was fantastic. Quentin, as you might know, is leaving his entire collection to House Illustration, which is incredibly generous. And we will, at some stage in the near future, want to have a space in his lifetime, and he's showing no signs of letting up in terms of, you know, the pace of work. I mean, I was talking to him this morning, and anyway, I've got to go, Colin, because I've got to finish drawing for such and such. I've got a deadline tomorrow for such and such, and then I've got the exhibition opening in Hastings in 2 weeks' time. I mean, it's extraordinary. We want a space within the gallery that's devoted to different aspects of his work. And, you know, he's an author an author and illustrator who has illustrated something like 600 books. So, you know, every week there's a different anniversary we can celebrate in some way. And he has such enduring appeal, not just in this country, but internationally. It's quite extraordinary. In terms of things that are coming up, so after the Matt Connor show closes, and this is great, I mean, this is a 101-year-old man. I mean, have you all seen the exhibition? I mean, it's so amazing. He didn't have an exhibition until he was 100. And he agreed to do our exhibition on his 101st birthday, which is just, you know, amazing, isn't it? What you might not know is that so he's one of the original Mad Men. He lives in an amazing apartment on 5th Avenue. He did very well. He was confirmed bachelor until he was 46, and then suddenly he got married. He married someone who was a Vanderbilt Whitney. And so, do you think Whitney Museum, Vanderbilt money? He did very well. Someone said to him, you know, there's the announcement in the New York Times, you know, Matt, what happened? He said, well, you know, I met the sweetest girl and she unconfirmed me. He said, confirmed bachelor for 46 years, and then it was, and very, very happy marriage and children, and sadly his wife died about 15 years ago. He was part of Madison Avenue in the golden era, the 50s and 60s, when there were 600 ad agencies in a very small area on Madison Avenue. And the life expectancy of people working on Madison Avenue in advertising was 10 years below the national average, because they smoked, they realised the health-giving properties of cork-tipped cigarettes at an early stage, they drank very heavily, and they worked incredibly hard. So he, being 101, is quite an extraordinary survival. He also kept his own artwork, which was unusual, because what would happen, the work would be produced quite quickly, 2 or 3 week period to produce finished artwork, and then it would be photographed, and often the ad agency would keep the work and usually destroy it. A lot of work of his contemporaries would have just disappeared. His agent, insisted on the artwork coming back, and he keeps it all in his 5th Avenue apartment. Hasn't been exposed to light. It shows the benefits of not exposing work to light, because the colours are so extraordinary still. So, you know, we're delighted to be doing this as an exhibition, and it's got a great backstory because of Matt Connor. When that show closes, we will be opening a show devoted to Ladybird books, which we brought from the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill. When we saw that this was happening there, we've got to come to London, and there's only one place it can come to, which is us. again, it's so important because it's showing the way in which illustration linked to very clever publishing not just can be so enduringly successful, but can have a profound influence on children's minds and the way they grow up. So I went to see the exhibition, took my children. It was 3 generations there of people. It was grandparents, parents and children. The children really not having experienced Ladybird books before, being absolutely captivated by them, and my generation just being so thrilled to see the things that we all grew up with, and my parents' generation knowing they had bought these books, and they shaped our world because they told us about the history of our country, not just our country but other countries. In terms of travel, my first sort of images of America were the book on America, which has an incredibly iconic cover of, I suppose, a 1960s jet flying over New York, and in those beautiful blues and greys and sort of silvers that actually Matt Connor uses in his own image of an airline in the 1950s. It's such an extraordinary exhibition, and it's about illustration linked to education and the role that publishing plays. So we're really thrilled that that's coming to us. It's curated by someone called Lawrence Zegan, who teaches at University of the Arts in London, and we're working really closely with him on this show, and it'll be a slightly different show to the one down there, but very thrilling. And I went home to my parents the other day, and there were my 18 Ladybird books still there, including the one that I'd actually nicked from the hospital that I was in when I was 5, and it still had the Red Cross sticker on the front. I think I probably am going to have to send that back. But then there was a lovely thing in the show at Bexhill, which was they had little vox pops, and one was a very eminent professor of history who said, well, of course, when I was doing my definitive book on Elizabethan history, I had in front of me the Ladybird book of Elizabeth first, and he wasn't joking. There's a wonderful apocryphal story that the book that Ladybird did on hovercrafts, is still used by any organisation that has a fleet of hovercrafts. It's the only book that really explains in simple terms how the hovercraft works. I don't know, Lawrence tells this story, and I think it's probably apocryphal, but it's a really good story. Anyway, so that's our next big show. And then we follow that by, we're really excited about this, E.H. Shepard is obviously known to all of you, but it's E.H. Shepard, as you won't have seen him before. We're not doing Winnie the Pooh, we're not doing The Wind in the Willows. In 1915, in October 1915, though he was a family man with children, he decided to enlist in the army, in the artillery, and by early 1916 he was in France. He served throughout the First World War, first on the Western Front, and then in Italy. And throughout the time that he was a Royal Artillery officer, in the midst of battle, he was still illustrating. Not just illustrating what was around him, and he does that beautifully, and the works really are not known, haven't been exhibited before, not least because a lot of them are still in the family's hands. But he was also, his agent was saying, dear Shepard, I need in 2 days'